Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. This content is for entertainment purposes.
What happens when a Hollywood icon, known for surviving storms both on and off the screen, realizes a casual laugh on live television has quietly crossed a line she's spent her entire career protecting? The studio lights were warm, almost flattering, the kind that softened edges and made even tension look polite at first glance. Halle Berry sat with her legs crossed, posture composed, a calm elegance that came from decades of navigating rooms where expectations were sharp and forgiveness was rare. She wore a faint smile, the practiced kind, the kind that told the audience she was comfortable, open, ready to talk. Around her, the familiar energy of the table buzzed, papers shuffling, quiet laughter from the audience, a producer's voice fading into silence as the red light blinked on. Joy Behar leaned forward slightly, glasses perched low, that signature half-smile already forming before the question even landed. It was the smile of someone who believed she was about to say something clever, something edgy, something the audience would chuckle at before the show moved on. At first, everything sounded harmless. A reference to Halle's career. A nod to her longevity in an industry that discards women the moment they age out of a headline. There were a few nods, a few approving murmurs. Halle tilted her head, listening carefully, her eyes focused not just on Joy, but on the rhythm of the room itself. Then Joy added the line. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel on the surface. It slipped out wrapped in humor, dressed as a joke, the kind that relied on familiarity and stereotypes that television had been dining on for decades. A comment about resilience, about handling difficult men, about how Halle had learned to deal with it all in a way that sounded far too close to dismissing the weight of what she'd endured. A ripple of laughter moved through part of the audience, uncertain, polite, scattered. The kind of laughter people give when they are not sure if they are allowed not to laugh. Halle's smile didn't disappear immediately. Instead, it froze. For half a second, the room felt suspended, like a breath held too long. Halle's eyes flicked down toward the table, then back up, locking onto Joy with a calm that was suddenly very deliberate. Anyone watching closely could see it, the shift. Her shoulders squared, not defensively, but decisively. This wasn't anger bubbling up. This was clarity settling in. Joy continued, unaware or perhaps too comfortable to notice the change. She chuckled at her own remark, adding a quick follow-up, trying to push the moment forward before it had a chance to sit still. But Halle didn't move forward with her. She exhaled slowly, then leaned in just enough for the microphones to catch every syllable. "Can I stop you there for a second?" she said softly. The audience quieted. Not completely, but enough. Even the co-hosts paused, sensing that this wasn't a playful interruption. This wasn't banter. Joy blinked, surprised, then waved her hand lightly. "Oh, of course. I'm just kidding, you know." "I know," Halle replied, still calm. "And that's actually why I want to say something." The tone wasn't confrontational. It was measured, almost gentle. That somehow made it sharper. Halle folded her hands together on the table, fingers interlaced, grounding herself. Inside, years of memories pressed against her ribs. Auditions where she was told she was too much and not enough at the same time. Headlines that praised her beauty while questioning her worth. Moments she'd smiled through because correcting them felt exhausting. She'd learned when to let things slide. She'd also learned when not to. When we laugh about things like that, she continued, it can sound like strength. But sometimes it's actually minimizing what it costs to survive certain spaces. A murmur rippled through the audience. Not laughter this time. Recognition. Joy shifted in her seat, her smile tightening. "I didn't mean it that way. You know I admire you." "I believe that," Halle said, meeting her eyes directly. "And I appreciate it. But admiration doesn't mean we can joke about what people had to endure to earn it." One of the co-hosts glanced between them, eyebrows raised slightly. Whoopi Goldberg leaned back, her expression unreadable, but her eyes stayed locked on Halle, listening closely. Joy tried again, a familiar instinct kicking in. "I just meant, you're tough. You handled it." Halle nodded once. "I handled it because I had to. Not because it was okay." That landed heavier. The studio felt different now. The warmth of the lights didn't soften the air anymore. It sharpened it. Every camera angle suddenly mattered. Every reaction shot became part of the story unfolding in real time. Halle continued, her voice steady, never rising. "There's a line between celebrating resilience and normalizing what people shouldn't have to be resilient against." Silence followed. Real silence. The kind television hates because it can't be edited out live. Joy opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, the quick comeback didn't arrive on time. Inside Halle's chest, her heart thudded, not from fear, but from resolve. She wasn't here to embarrass anyone. She wasn't here to scold. She was here because boundaries, once drawn, mattered. Especially when millions were watching. I've spent a long time protecting my peace, Halle added. And that means being honest in moments like this. A few audience members nodded. Someone whispered ham a little too loudly. Joy let out a small laugh, but it lacked its usual confidence. Fair enough. But Halle wasn't done, not yet. Not aggressively. Just truthfully. I'm happy to talk about my work, my journey, even my mistakes, she said. But I don't want my survival to be the punchline. That was it. The line, drawn cleanly, without theatrics. The applause started slowly, hesitant at first, then grew. Not thunderous, but sincere. It wasn't applause for drama. It was applause for clarity. Joy joined in clapping, nodding along, though her expression betrayed something else, reflection, maybe. Or discomfort. Or both. Whoopi finally spoke, her voice grounding the moment. That's real. And that's fair. Halle leaned back, the tension easing from her shoulders just a bit. She offered a small, polite smile, not triumphant, not smug. Just settled. The show moved on, as live television always does. A segue. A breath. Another question. But something fundamental had shifted. The audience could feel it. The hosts could feel it. And somewhere beyond the studio walls, millions of viewers were replaying the moment in their heads, recognizing a boundary they'd wished they could draw themselves. Halle answered the next question with grace, but her presence carried a new weight. Not fragile. Not defensive. Grounded. And as the cameras rolled on, one thing was clear. This wasn't about a joke gone wrong. It was about a woman choosing, in real time, to define how her story would be told. The air never fully returned to normal after that moment. Even as the conversation shifted, even as Joy offered up a new question with a lighter tone, something subtle lingered between the chairs at the table, like a chord that had been struck and refused to fade. Halle Berry answered politely, professionally, but there was a new precision in her words now. Each sentence felt chosen, intentional, as if she were walking carefully through a room she'd just realized was full of fragile glass. Joy tried to recover her rhythm. She leaned back, then forward again, her hands moving as they always did when she wanted to steer the energy somewhere safer. So let's talk about what you're working on now, she said, smiling wider than before. Because you're everywhere again. Halle nodded. I'm grateful for that, she replied. And she was. Truly. But gratitude didn't require silence, and the audience could sense that distinction settling into the room. As Halle spoke about her latest project, about choosing roles that reflected where she was now rather than where people expected her to stay, the camera occasionally cut to Joy. Each time, her expression shifted just a little, attentive, yes, but also guarded. She laughed at the right moments, but the laughter felt measured now, like someone walking across ice they hadn't realized was thin until it cracked. What viewers at home couldn't hear were the tiny sounds in the studio that spoke volumes. A producer's pen tapping against a clipboard. A camera operator adjusting position a beat too quickly. The audience's reactions, now slower, more thoughtful, less automatic. They weren't just watching entertainment anymore. They were witnessing negotiation. Boundaries being tested, redrawn, respected, or resisted. Joy jumped in again when Halle paused. You've always been someone who breaks barriers, she said, clearly aiming for affirmation. Firsts, milestones. You've carried a lot on your shoulders. Halle met her halfway. I have, she agreed. But I don't carry it alone. And I don't carry it quietly anymore. That line wasn't accusatory. It was declarative. And it landed. Sunny shifted in her chair, glancing at Whoopi before speaking. I think that's something a lot of women relate to, she added. That moment when you decide you're done absorbing everything just to keep things comfortable. Halle smiled at her, genuinely this time. Exactly. Joy nodded too quickly. Sure. I mean, that's growth, right? She chuckled. We're all learning. But Halle's gaze returned to Joy, calm but steady. We are, she said. And learning sometimes means unlearning what we thought was harmless. Joy's laugh faded halfway through. The audience responded with a low murmur, approval mixed with unease. This wasn't scripted tension. This was real-time recalibration. Inside Joy's mind, something churned. She'd built a career on sharp humor, on saying the thing others wouldn't, on pushing until someone pushed back. Usually, that pushback came with heat, with raised voices or sarcasm she could spar against. This was different. Halle wasn't sparring. She wasn't performing outrage. She was holding a mirror up and refusing to blink. Joy adjusted her glasses again, a small tell she rarely noticed herself. "I just hope people don't think I was dismissing anything," she said, more to the audience than to Halle. Halle didn't rush to reassure her. That was the most telling part. "I think intent matters," Halle said after a pause. "But impact matters too." Another beat. Another quiet stretch of air. Whoopi cleared her throat. "That's always been true," she said evenly. "And it's something we all got to sit with sometimes." The show moved forward, but now the tension wasn't just between two women. It had spread outward, filling the studio, reaching into living rooms and phones and comment sections that were already beginning to light up. Halle spoke about motherhood next. About raising children in a world that would try to define them before they defined themselves. Her voice softened when she mentioned them, but her words sharpened too, shaped by the same conviction that had drawn the line earlier. "I want my kids to know that speaking up doesn't make you difficult," she said. "It makes you honest." The audience applauded more quickly this time. Louder. Joy joined in again, nodding, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the producer's table. She knew this moment was bigger than a segment now. She could feel it slipping beyond her control. During a brief pause, as the hosts shuffled their notes, Joy leaned slightly toward Halle. "I really do respect you," she said quietly, her mic still hot. Halle turned to her, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "I know," she replied. "And respect grows when we listen." That sentence echoed longer than the applause ever could. The next question came from Whoopi, who had been unusually reserved until now. "You've been in this industry a long time," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Do you feel like things are changing? Or are we still having the same conversations in new packaging?" Halle exhaled, considering. "Both," she said. "There's progress. There's also repetition. Sometimes the hardest part is realizing how often people confuse familiarity with permission." Joy stiffened almost imperceptibly. Halle continued, not looking at her now, but out toward the audience, the cameras, the millions beyond them. "Just because I've navigated something before doesn't mean I want to keep reliving it as entertainment." That was the heart of it. The unspoken truth made spoken. The audience's reaction wasn't explosive. It was heavy, thoughtful. Some clapped. Some didn't. Some sat very still. Joy attempted one last pivot, her voice lighter but edged with something brittle. "Well, television is all about conversation," she said. "And sometimes conversations get messy." "They do," Halle agreed. "But messiness doesn't excuse carelessness." There it was again. Not anger. Not accusation. Just a standard being set. By the time the segment wrapped, the smiles felt different. Halle hugged each host warmly, professionally, but when she reached Joy, the embrace was brief. Polite. Respectful. Boundaried. As Halle walked off set, the audience applauded, some standing, some seated, all aware they'd seen something rare. Not a blow-up. Not a viral shouting match. But a moment where power shifted quietly, unmistakably. Backstage, Halle paused just long enough to breathe. The adrenaline hit then, delayed but real. Her hands trembled slightly before she tucked them into her jacket pockets. She knew what moments like this could become once they escaped the room. She'd lived through it before. Headlines would flatten nuance. Clips would isolate sentences. Opinions would harden fast. But she also knew she'd said what needed to be said. In another corner of the building, Joy sat down heavily, her laughter from the segment already feeling distant. She replayed the exchange in her mind, every word, every pause. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even defensive anymore. She was unsettled. And for someone who thrived on certainty, that was uncomfortable. A producer leaned in. "You okay?" they asked. Joy nodded, though her expression said otherwise. "Yeah," she said. "I think so." But the truth was, something had shifted for her too. Halle hadn't embarrassed her. She'd challenged her, without theatrics, without cruelty. That kind of challenge lingered. By the time Halle stepped outside, the first notifications were already lighting up phones. Short clips. Captions stripped of context. Some praising her calm. Some accusing her of being too sensitive. The familiar split forming almost instantly. Halle glanced at her phone once, then slid it back into her bag. She wasn't ready to see the world's reaction yet. She didn't need it to validate the moment. Inside the studio, Joy watched the monitors replay a silent shot of Halle speaking, her expression composed, her words unheard but unmistakable. For the first time in a long while, Joy didn't rush to fill the space with a joke. She sat with it. And as the show rolled into its next segment, the audience at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing what was coming next, not just from the table, but from the fallout that always follows when a line is drawn clearly, on live television, by someone who refuses to erase herself to keep the peace. By the time Halle stepped outside, the first notifications were already lighting up phones. Short clips, captions stripped of context, some praising her calm, some accusing her of being too sensitive. The familiar split forming almost instantly. The moment didn't end when the cameras cut away. It stretched. It followed Halle down the hallway, followed Joy back to her chair, followed the audience out of the studio and into their phones, their group chats, their unspoken thoughts. By the time the show aired on the West Coast, the clip had already taken on a life of its own. Inside the green room, Halle sat alone for a few minutes longer than usual. She hadn't asked for company. She hadn't reached for her phone again. Instead, she stared at her reflection in the mirror, makeup flawless, expression calm, eyes steady. The woman looking back at her didn't look shaken. She looked resolved. But beneath that stillness, her thoughts moved quickly. She replayed the moment again, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood how moments like this got rewritten once they were no longer hers alone. She knew the rules. A calm boundary could be reframed as cold. A measured tone could be called condescending. Silence could be read as judgment. She had seen it happen to others. She had lived it herself. A knock came softly at the door. Halle didn't turn immediately. "Come in," she said. One of the show's producers stepped inside, her face careful, professional, but warm. "Just wanted to check on you," she said. That was a moment. Halle smiled faintly. It was. The producer hesitated. "Are you okay?" Halle nodded. "I am." I knew what I was saying. The producer relaxed slightly. "I figured. I just wanted you to know, we respect that." Halle appreciated the words, but she also understood their limits. Respect in the room didn't always translate to protection outside of it. Still, she thanked her, and the producer left her alone again. Meanwhile, down the hall, Joy sat with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She stared at the surface, watching the steam curl upward, then dissipate. The laughter that usually carried her through moments of tension hadn't arrived this time. Instead, there was a heaviness she couldn't shake. She wasn't angry at Halle. That surprised her. She was irritated with herself. Joy replayed her own words now, hearing them differently. Not as she'd intended them, but as they might land. She hated that feeling. The realization that something she thought was harmless had carried more weight than she'd accounted for. She prided herself on being sharp, not careless. On challenging others, not being corrected on live television. Yet she couldn't deny it. Halle hadn't raised her voice. Hadn't grandstanded. Hadn't embarrassed her for sport. She'd simply refused to play along. Joy exhaled slowly and finally took a sip of her coffee, grimacing as it burned her tongue. The discomfort felt deserved somehow. As the hours passed, the internet did what it always did, split into camps. Halle Berry shuts down Joy Behar live. Halle Berry too sensitive. Joy Behar crosses the line again. Clips circulated without context, captions growing sharper with each repost. Some slowed Halle's pauses dramatically. Others isolated Joy's smile. Comment sections filled with certainty from people who hadn't been in the room, hadn't felt the shift, hadn't heard the silence. Halle's publicist called first. "You okay?" she asked, not bothering with small talk. "I'm fine," Halle said honestly. "There's noise," the publicist continued. "A lot of praise. Some backlash." Halle expected nothing less. "I didn't say anything I don't stand by." "I know," the publicist replied. "And for what it's worth, a lot of people are saying they felt seen." That mattered more than numbers. More than trends. Still, as night fell, Halle sat at home, finally scrolling through her phone. She read a few comments, women thanking her for naming something they'd swallowed for years. Mothers talking about teaching their daughters how to draw lines without apologizing. A few men admitting they'd never thought about jokes like that before. She stopped scrolling before the cruelty could reach her. She'd learned that lesson too. Across the city, Joy sat at her kitchen table, the TV on but muted. Her phone buzzed constantly. Messages from friends. From colleagues. from people she hadn't heard from in years, offering opinions she hadn't asked for. One text stood out. "You handled that gracefully." So did she. Joy stared at it for a long moment. Grace. That word lingered. The next morning, the panel reconvened for another show. The energy was different from the moment they sat down. The audience buzzed louder, anticipation hanging thick in the air. Everyone knew why. Everyone was waiting to see if the elephant in the room would be acknowledged or ignored. Joy adjusted her notes, feeling the weight of expectation. She could deflect. She could joke. She could move on as if nothing had happened. She'd done it before. But the image of Halle's steady gaze returned to her mind. The calm certainty. The line drawn without cruelty. When the cameras went live, the opening banter unfolded as usual, but it felt performative now. Eventually, Whoopi leaned forward, eyes scanning the table. "Before we move on," she said, "I want to address something from yesterday." The audience hushed instantly. Joy felt her pulse quicken. Whoopi continued, her voice even. "We had a conversation that struck a chord, and I think it's worth acknowledging." Joy swallowed, then nodded slowly. Whoopi turned slightly toward her. "Joy." Joy cleared her throat. For once, she didn't rush. "Yeah," she said. "I've been thinking about it." The audience leaned in. "I want to say this," Joy continued. "My intention was humor. But I hear now that the impact wasn't that. And that matters." The room stayed quiet. She glanced briefly toward the camera, then back at the table. "I respect Halle Berry. And I respect what she said. We're all learning, even after all these years." It wasn't an apology in the dramatic sense. It wasn't a tearful confession. But it was something else, an acknowledgement. A pause. A moment of humility. Whoopi nodded once. That's how conversations grow. The audience applauded, measured, supportive. Halle wasn't there to hear it. But she would later. When she did, she sat quietly, watching the clip alone. She didn't smile. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt something quieter. Relief. Not because Joy had said the right thing, but because the line she'd drawn hadn't been erased. It had been seen. Later that week, during an interview with a different outlet, Halle was asked about the moment. The interviewer leaned forward, clearly hoping for fireworks. "Do you think Joy crossed a line?" they asked. Halle paused, then answered carefully. "I think moments like that are opportunities. What matters is what we do with them." The interviewer pressed. "Would you go back and do anything differently?" Halle shook her head. "No. I spoke my truth calmly. That's all I ever aimed to do." The clip circulated too, but this one landed differently. Less sensational. More reflective. Joy, for her part, stopped making jokes about it. She didn't reference it again on air. But subtle changes appeared in her language. A hesitation before certain comments. A question instead of a punchline. Viewers noticed. Some praised her growth. Some accused her of being muted. Joy read both and said little. In quiet moments, she thought about something Halle had said, about familiarity not being permission. It unsettled her because it rang true. Weeks later, the moment still resurfaced online, now framed as a turning point rather than a blow-up. Articles analyzed it. Commentators debated it. But for the women at the center of it, the noise faded into something smaller. For Halle, it became another brick in a foundation she'd been building for years, a commitment to speak without spectacle, to protect her peace without apology. For Joy, it became a reminder that sharpness didn't have to mean dismissal, that wit didn't have to override listening. And for the audience, it became something rarer than viral outrage. It became a moment where a boundary was drawn clearly, respected imperfectly, and allowed to exist without being burned down for entertainment. The kind of moment that doesn't scream, but echoes. The echoes didn't fade quietly. They traveled farther than anyone in that studio could have predicted, weaving themselves into conversations that had nothing to do with daytime television and everything to do with how people spoke to one another when power, history, and humor collided. By the end of the week, Halle Berry's name wasn't just trending alongside clips of the show. It was appearing in essays, podcasts, late-night monologues, and think pieces dissecting the idea of boundaries. Who gets to draw them? Who gets uncomfortable when they appear? And why calm refusal so often unsettles more than anger ever could. Halle watched very little of it. She had learned long ago that once a moment becomes public property, it no longer belongs to the person who lived it. It becomes a reflection screen. People project themselves onto it. Their wounds. Their guilt. Their defenses. Instead, She focused on her life as it actually existed. School drop-offs, script meetings, long walks where she let the noise drain out of her body. Still, the ripple reached her in quieter ways. A woman stopped her outside a cafe and said, voice shaking slightly, "Thank you for saying what I never could at my job." A younger actress sent her a message, admitting she'd replayed the clip before a difficult meeting just to remind herself she didn't have to laugh things off to survive. Even a veteran producer she'd known for years pulled her aside and said, "That made me rethink some things." Those moments stayed with her more than any headline ever could. Joy Behar felt the ripple differently. She noticed it in the pause before laughter now, in the way audiences listened more closely to her words, not with hostility, but with attention. She noticed it in herself most of all, in the split second where she considered impact before delivery, where she let a thought sit instead of launching it. It wasn't that she'd lost her edge. It was that the edge had been honed. Privately, Joy spoke about it with only a few people she trusted. "I didn't feel attacked," she admitted one evening, sitting across from a longtime friend. "I felt checked." Her friend smiled. "That's not the worst thing." "No," Joy agreed. "It's not." The audience, meanwhile, had chosen sides and then slowly drifted into something more nuanced. The loudest voices burned out quickly, as they always did. What remained were quieter conversations, threads where people talked about jokes they'd laughed at without realizing why, about times they'd swallowed discomfort to keep things smooth, about how power didn't always announce itself loudly. Media coverage shifted too. What began as awkward TV moment evolved into discussions about workplace culture, generational humor, and the difference between admiration and entitlement. Halle's calm delivery was dissected frame by frame, praised not because it was polite, but because it was firm without being cruel. That distinction mattered. Weeks later, Halle returned to another talk show. A different set, a different host. The conversation was warm, respectful, even light-hearted. But midway through, the host asked carefully, "Do you feel pressure now to always be the example?" Halle considered the question, then shook her head. "No, I just feel responsible for myself. That's enough." That clip didn't go as viral. It didn't need to. At The View, the panel dynamics continued, familiar yet subtly altered. Joy still joked. Whoopi still anchored the table with her presence. Sunny still pushed with precision. But there was a shared awareness now, an unspoken understanding that lines existed even in friendly territory. One morning, months later, a guest made a flippant remark about handling it like a pro after describing a clearly uncomfortable situation. Joy paused, then gently redirected. "Or," she said, "maybe we ask why they had to handle it at all." The audience applauded. Not wildly, but knowingly. Someone clipped that moment too. Halle saw it one night, scrolling absent-mindedly. She stopped, watched it twice, then smiled softly. Not because she felt responsible for it, but because she recognized the ripple. She never reached out to Joy privately. Joy never reached out to her. They didn't need to. Respect didn't require a public reconciliation or a dramatic follow-up. It had already done its work in the open. The original clip continued to resurface in waves, especially when similar moments happened elsewhere. Another guest pushing back, another host recalibrating, another audience witnessing tension handled without theatrics. Halle's moment became a reference point. A shorthand. Like when Halle Berry drew that line. And that, more than anything, surprised her. She hadn't intended to make a statement. She'd intended to protect her peace. But peace, she learned again, could be instructive. On the anniversary of the episode, a journalist asked her if she ever worried about being labeled difficult after moments like that. Halle laughed softly. "I stopped worrying about that years ago," she said. "The label usually says more about the person using it than the person receiving it." The comment landed quietly, then spread. Joy read it too. She nodded once, alone in her apartment, then turned off her phone. She didn't feel defensive. She felt aligned. Not in agreement with everything, but in understanding the value of the pause. The value of listening past the joke. For the audience, the moment settled into memory not as a scandal, but as a study in restraint. No shouting. No walking off set. Just a clear line, drawn calmly, held firmly. That was the part that lingered. Because in a culture addicted to explosions, this had been something else entirely. It had been a reminder that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks evenly, looks you in the eye, and refuses to move. And that kind of power is harder to dismiss. "Now, it's your turn," Did Halle Berry handle that moment the right way? Did Joy Behar cross a line? Or did the conversation need to happen exactly as it did? Where do you think boundaries should be drawn when humor, history, and respect collide? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let the conversation continue.